So as Gillian said, these findings today are coming from the disability module in the 2009 Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey, and that was funded by the Office for Disability Issues, and the same questions were asked in the British Social Attitude Survey 2009 as were asked in the Northern Ireland Life and Times survey. In keeping with the disability rights movement mantra of nothing about us without us, the insights on interpretation of the data were provided by members of the Foyle Mind Yourself advocacy group, which is a mental health service users group, and I want to say thank you to them. I think there's maybe somebody here today from Mind Yourself, but if not, they all said that they go to watch the video cast afterwards, so I hope that I don't say anything that they'll criticise me for. They're actually very funny, and I'll tell you some of their jokes later, just to keep everybody on their toes. Right, just to start with the kind of most basic question. The question of, do you have a long-term physical or mental health condition or disability? Basically a quarter of the respondents, and remember it's a representative sample of that the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey has, so 26% consider themselves to have a long-term physical or mental health condition or disability. So that's kind of fluctuates between 19 and 26-27% different years, and I don't think that you can it's not that you can say that there's more people now who consider themselves to have a long-term physical or mental health condition or disability, because actually this question is asked every year as part of the background bit of the Northern Ireland Life and Time Survey, and like I say, it just goes up and down, so it would suggest that we're probably talking about maybe 23 or 24% if you were to average them out over all of the years. Okay, I think it's important to say that while about a quarter of people have a long-term physical or mental health disability, it is safe to say that about half of us can expect to be disabled by the time we reach 65 years of age, and I think it's an important point to make, because a lot of the time disability is seen as something, you know, that's other people are disabled, but actually most of us can expect by the time, if half of us by the time we're 65, I think by the time we're 75, about two-thirds of us can expect to have a disability. So that's just to remind you. Okay, to get on to the attitudes thing. One of the questions that was asked, or several of the questions that were asked people, is, do they think of disabled people, do the respondents think of disabled people in a particular way? And here were some of the things. Do you think of disabled people as getting in the way, being the same as everyone else, needing to be cared for, and as productive as non-disabled people? And as you can see, the attitudes are generally, the first two lots seem to be very good, generally speaking, so only 8% of people see disabled people as getting in the way, although 8% is bad enough. And 90% say that they see disabled people as the same as everyone else. So when I saw that, I thought, that's brilliant. 9 out of 10 people see disabled people as the same as everyone else. And then I looked at, you know, do you see disabled people as needing to be cared for? Well, I suppose it depends on what you mean by needing to be cared for. Maybe they're taking that in a general, you know, we all care for somebody way. But I fear not. I fear that it's actually quite a patronising attitude of, you know, that 3 out of 4 people, 77%, think that disabled people need care, you know, as opposed to love and affection, sort of the kind of care that means that that includes things like protection, and one fears that it may be a patronising, like I say, attitude or paternalistic attitude, and I guess in a way that's confirmed by the fact that almost half see disabled people as less productive than non-disabled people, and you can these figures are actually somewhat better than the British figures. I didn't have, we don't have all of the exact same, the raw data for Britain, although we hope we'll actually have it by the time we make this into an ARK update. But it is the case, for example, that in Britain, 78% of people think that disabled people are the same as everyone else, and even more people think that disabled people are less productive than non-disabled people. However, the good news is, as you can see, that well over a quarter of people think that disabled people are as productive as non-disabled people, and only 4% never think of disabled people as being the same as everyone else. So that is, I guess, some good news. When we look then, when people were asked whether they would feel comfortable, people were asked how comfortable they would feel if somebody with a particular disability moved in next door to them, if they were appointed as their boss, or were they to marry and have a family with a close family member of theirs. And we do have, quite a high proportion of respondents said that they would feel very comfortable. They would feel very comfortable with somebody with a physical disability, and a physical disability was described as somebody who has problems perhaps using their arms or their legs, or using their arms or perhaps using a wheelchair. As you can see, 82% of people said they would feel very comfortable with somebody with a physical disability moving in next door to them. 2/3 saying that they would feel very comfortable having somebody with a physical disability as their boss, and almost 2/3, 63%, saying that they would feel very comfortable with a family member marrying and having a family with somebody with a physical disability. And in brackets there are the figures for similar attitudes in Britain. So we're generally more comfortable here in relation to people with physical disability. When we come to sensory impairment, the figures are very, very similar to physical disability. Although interestingly enough, fewer people happy to have somebody with a sensory impairment as their boss. Learning disability, as you can see, the figures start to change, and with learning disability, well, still 3 out of 4 people very comfortable about somebody with a learning disability, and the learning disability was described as, for example, Down syndrome or autism. So somebody with a learning disability, for example, Down syndrome or autism, 73% of people very comfortable about moving in next door. Far fewer very comfortable with having somebody with a learning disability appointed as their boss, but double the number that there would be in Britain who'd feel very comfortable with that. And 4 out of 10, 2 out of 5 people very comfortable with a close family member marrying and having a family with somebody with a learning disability. Again, a far higher proportion than in Britain. It's when we come to the mental health conditions that we really see the figures changing very much, and discriminatory attitudes, which are clearly there in relation to people with learning disability, are very much there in relation to people with mental health conditions. So only 40% of people would feel very comfortable with somebody with a mental health condition, and a mental health condition was described as, for example, depression or personality disorder. Only 40% very comfortable with somebody with such a mental health condition moving in next door to them. Less than 1/3 happy about feeling very comfortable about having somebody with a mental health condition appointed as their boss, and a similarly small number very comfortable to have somebody with a mental health condition marrying and having a family with a close family member. That's the very comfortable end of things. When people were asked how they would feel about each of those issues, they were asked would they feel very, very comfortable, fairly comfortable, quite uncomfortable, fairly uncomfortable, or very uncomfortable. And when we look at what people felt very uncomfortable about, uncomfortable or very uncomfortable about, you can see that that really almost nobody was uncomfortable about having somebody with a physical or a sensory impairment moving in next door to them. 4% of people feeling uncomfortable about having somebody with a learning disability, with 18%, that's more than 1 in 6 people feeling uncomfortable about having somebody with a mental health condition moving in next door to them. In terms of being appointed as a boss, a third of people would feel uncomfortable having somebody with a mental health condition as their boss, and even more than that, uncomfortable having somebody with a mental health condition marrying into their family. You can see the learning disability figures are also quite high here, but I think that maybe the difference would be in the number of people within our society who have a learning disability, a severe learning disability, especially like Down syndrome or autism, compared to the normality, as it were, of mental health conditions. And that's maybe something that I will come back to in the discussion when we come to discussion points. And it's just something that I'd like you to consider. I mean, I think Pascal might be able to tell me what the proportion of people who do have either Down syndrome or autism in our society is, but I think it's probably about 2%. Yeah, that's what I thought. And like I say, we can talk later about just the difference when it comes to talking about people with mental health conditions. Okay. Also, people were asked whether attempts to give equal rights to disabled people have gone too far. And I'm glad to say that only 5% of our population think that it's gone too far. And actually, the majority of respondents actually said that it hadn't gone far enough. There was if you take out the ones who couldn't choose and didn't know, then the majority say that actually equal rights for disabled people, that hasn't really gone far enough. It has to be said that on almost all of these issues, Gillian asked me on the way up whether there was a gender difference in them, and there was. The biggest difference wasn't in relation to anything to do with age, wasn't in relation anything to do with religion, it was to do with gender. And women overwhelmingly, like there's a 10 or 12% difference between men's attitudes and women's attitudes, and women were like 10 or 12% more 10 or 12% more women were comfortable with people with all kinds of disabilities, living next to them, being part of their family, being their bosses, whatever. And women were also more likely to say that disabled people didn't necessarily need cared for. They didn't see them as getting cared for as much as men did, even though the women were more likely to be doing any caring that needs to be done. And women were also more likely to say that that disabled people don't get in the way. So just thought I would put that one in. I thought it was kind of interesting. Actually, before we go to the discussion points, I did want to just say one other thing about differences, and that was in relation to age, because I had assumed, to be perfectly honest with you, that younger people would have more equal attitudes, less discriminatory attitudes towards all kinds of disability than would older people. And you would sort of hope that, really, and unfortunately that's not the case. Generally speaking, younger people have pretty much the same kind of views as the older generation, except when it comes to mental health conditions, where younger people have more discriminatory views. And so there clearly is an issue, and I'll be talking about that in the discussion. But when I talked to the people from Mind Yourself, they suggested that maybe it was that young people don't have the same life experience, and so they see, they don't understand that actually most people will become mentally ill at some stage in their lives. They just assume that they're invincible and that they're never going to get ill of any variety, and that may be a part of the explanation, that why it is as you get older that you're more likely to see somebody who's mentally ill as just being the same as yourself or anybody else. Okay, so in regards to people with mental health issues, it has to be said that Northern Ireland has higher levels of mental ill health than either the rest of the UK or the Republic of Ireland. And in fact, the GHSSPSNI itself suggests that our level of mental ill health is 25% greater than the rest of the UK. And that would suggest that at any one time, about 1 in 3 of us will be mentally ill, and it, to varying degrees. And therefore, it does occur to me that when people are saying that they wouldn't like somebody who's mentally ill moving in next door to them, that it's probably too late. They probably are already living next door to them, or possibly in their own house. And that's a very important message, I think, to get across, that if you take any 3 houses, that the chances are that there will be somebody who's mentally unwell at that time living in one of those houses, and like I say, it might well be your own. It has to be said that again that the mental health experts through experience that I spoke to in developing this presentation did suggest that when it came to the boss, but people not necessarily being comfortable with having somebody who's mentally ill as their boss, that maybe that's because they already thought their boss did have maybe a personality disorder or something. So I sort of thought that I was really glad that they gave me that joke, because it's the kind of joke that you'd be afraid to use in case it would be seen as discriminatory in its own way. And that's really what I want to talk about now, is the question of stigma. And stigma, also known as discrimination, and I think that really we do talk about stigma in relation to mental health, but I think that maybe it's time that we actually started talking about discrimination, because again, we were talking about this in the car on the way up, but the extent of discrimination against mentally ill people is so widespread that I think that a lot of the time, that until you start thinking about it, that you don't actually realise it. And I have been so challenged in my language ever since I started doing this work, and particularly ever since talking to the people from Mind Yourself. Everywhere I look now, I see the kind of discrimination that there is, and wonder why I'd never seen it before. Now, stigma has been described as an attribute that is deeply discrediting, and I think that that's actually quite a good definition, whether we're talking about people with mental health conditions, people living in or experiencing poverty, or whatever it is. The idea is that you're discredited in some way, because of this label that you've got, and it's been suggested that you need to look at stigmatisation as a process, not just and it can be broken down into things like labelling, stereotyping. Being set apart is different, very, very important in terms of the way that the media and everything shows people with actually all kinds of stigma and all kinds of disability. You can recognise labelling, stereotyping, being set aside as different, and finally various forms of disapproval, rejection, exclusion, and discrimination. And actually, when you look at the evidence from across the world, there's really a considerable evidence that the media's portrayal, especially of mental illness, directly affects both public attitudes, but also the self-conception of people who are with mental illness, which creates a stigma, a fear of labelling, a fear of being diagnosed and therefore labelled, that can prevent an individual from seeking treatment. And as a result, that mental illness can actually become worse, because in the same way as if you don't seek treatment for any physical illness, it's going to get worse. Clearly it's the same with mental illness. And so there is a real issue about how public attitudes and then the self-stigmatising that goes with, that can go with those public attitudes actually affect not just our attitudes to people who are mentally ill, but also people who are ill's attitude towards themselves and towards seeking treatment and undergoing that treatment. And reading the literature, I mean, like I say, it's really kind of opened up my eyes, because when you look through decades of research, and the research goes right back to the 60s, it really shows the extent to which the public holds very negative and quite inaccurate views about mentally ill people. And the main ones would be seeing them as dangerous, unpredictable, unattractive, unworthy, and crucially unlikely ever to contribute positively to society. And again, I found that when I went to speak to the experts through experience in Mind Yourself, that I was kind of bringing those ideas. So I was kind of saying, well, you know, maybe the problem is that people don't think of kind of ordinary mental illness like depression, that they think of things like personality disorders and schizophrenia. And of course, that in itself is a discriminatory view, you know, because I was accepting the kind of media notion that anybody who's got schizophrenia is dangerous and violent, or that anybody with personality disorder is dangerous or violent, whereas of course it's only a very, very small minority of people who've got those kind of mental illnesses that are in any way in danger, you know, in any way likely to create danger for anybody. But the media influence is so great, and when I'm talking about media here, I'm not just talking about newspapers and TV, I'm talking about films, I'm talking about everything really, even the way that we talk about people, you know, they're psycho. It's just, you know, it's how you would sort of talk about people, that it really has an impact on all of us. And I was really quite shocked to realise how much I myself like at Intern, and I would have picked myself as being very PC and very dead on. So I was very shocked, you know, to find that I had internalised these myself. So okay, how might we go about, just to finish off, tackling stigma and discrimination then? Well, first of all, we do have guidelines. For example, the NUJ, the National Union of Journalists, has guidelines on reporting disability-related issues, and those guidelines were drawn up in partnership with the Disability Alliance, and they are quite good, and they do kind of tell them, you know, to relax a wee bit, you know, that, because I did start to kind of get myself into a right tiz where every time I sort of said, oh, that's crazy, you know, I would be kind of going, oh, that's, you know, I'm using that discriminatory language again. And you know, one has to be careful not to kind of go over the top. And those guidelines, the NUJ guidelines, are sort of very clear about that, and say, you know, don't worry. Say somebody who's blind or something isn't going to get worried that you say, if you say see ya, you know, that people aren't that kind of uptight. But at the same time, they do point out, you know, the importance of not using language like psycho or schizo or any of those kind of insulting words as slang, when in fact they should be only used as you know, within very clear parameters of psychiatric terms. But the problem, of course, is that those guidelines aren't always adhered to, and in particular they're not always adhered to by the tabloids. And quite a lot of the studies that have been done that have analysed media portrayals of people with mental ill health, it's the tabloids who tend to be the worst and tend to you know, present only to present mentally ill people only as dangerous and difficult and a risk to the public. But it's not just the newspapers, and more importantly really is the popular and the mass media, especially television, which is far more influential. And we had a fairly long discussion about soap operas and the treatment of mentally ill people in soap operas. Now, I have to say that I watched Coronation Street, that's my soap opera, and I don't remember there being anybody who's mentally ill in it for some time, at least not the length of time that I've been watching it in the last while. But I'm told that in EastEnders, which I don't watch, it's very dark, I don't really like it, that there's actually been a mother and daughter who are bipolar, and the experts through experience that I was talking about were saying that the mother had, when she'd been first brought in as somebody who was bipolar, that the treatment was really, really bad, and she was shown as being, you know, somebody who really was unable to cope at all, and you know, who really wasn't somebody who was even a good mother, and that was a very, very bad portrayal of her. But that since that the daughter, who's now been diagnosed as bipolar, that the treatment of her has been much better, and you know, she's shown as a much more sympathetic character and everything. I do watch Shameless, and Shameless has also got a bipolar character in it, and I thought they treated her very badly in the last series, but somebody seems to have talked to them more recently, and so she's gone from being, you know, somebody who you really wouldn't want to let near your children, to being somebody that you'd be kind of happy enough to leave your children with. So clearly, you know, there's been some sort of development there as well, and there is obviously some element whereby the treatment of mental ill health within sort of popular TV has actually developed a wee bit. But the next generation. Like I said, I was very concerned to find that attitudes hadn't improved any among 18 to 24-year-olds, that 18 to 24-year-olds were as likely or even more likely to have discriminatory attitudes than older people. So I had a look, and researching children is kind of my main area of work. So I had a look to see, you know, what there was in the literature about children and children's attitudes to mental ill health generally, well, to disability generally, but especially to mental ill health. And reading the analysis, and there's loads of literature out there, you know, that looks at, that does large-scale studies of, you know, loads of films or loads of newspapers or whatever in a particular time frame, and stuff about children. Really, it made me go back and look at all of my daughter's videos and think, what was I doing? Even Disney videos, you know. Like in Mary Poppins, you know, Mary Poppins, when the dad sort of like right towards the end, and Mr. Banks decides that he's not going to do what he was always supposed to do, but instead he's going to play with his children and everything. Well, he was mad, wasn't he? You know, as soon as he started to behave kind of differently and everything. And he was shown as having kind of lost it completely, and then he was restored to the bosom of his family at the end, when he'd kind of gone back to stopping being mad and starting to behave kind of normal again. So even in Disney films, you know, the portrayal of people, yes, I'm going to shut up in a minute, the portrayal of people with mental illness is really very worrying. And one of the studies that I read, for example, looked at all of the PG or the general release or PG releases that there had been in a particular year. So these are all the films that children would get to see over the course of the year, and then they analysed how many of them had people with mental health conditions in them, and then how they were portrayed, etc. And there was, in 12 of the films, that was a quarter of the films that were looked at, of the films that children might see, there was somebody with mental illness in them, and in every case they were depicted as being, you know, people who looked unattractive, were failing in every way within their lives, were ridiculed by others, didn't benefit from treatment. Only 2 of them actually were seen having any form of treatment within the film, and for only 1 of them did it work. So there was a real, the study actually concluded that the message that's coming through to young people, to children even, to quite young children, is that using psychiatric terminology as slang, you know, you're crazy, you're psycho, you're you know, those kind of things, that it's appropriately associated with any kind of objectionable behaviour. So, you know, it's not necessarily that you've done something that suggests that you're mentally ill, but just that you've done something that I don't like. So I say you're psycho because I don't like what you've done. So therefore, that it's a good insult to have for any inappropriate behaviour. That children are actually getting the message that it's okay to use slang references to mental illnesses, although nobody's going to use slang references to other illnesses. And we were talking again just earlier about the way in which our language has changed, for example, towards other disabilities. It's no longer the case that we would say, when I was growing up, you know, if we didn't like somebody, we would say, you're a spastic. You know, nobody says that anymore. Nobody says that anymore, and if anybody did say it, anybody would come down on it like a ton of bricks. But it's okay to say you're psycho. And we actually say to each other all the time, oh, you're mad, or, you know, and we say to each other all the time. And so those kind of slang references are still acceptable within our society. Like I say, while slang references to other conditions wouldn't be. And the last message that's very clearly coming through to children from children's films is that those kind of disparaging terms can be used to disparage others and to show our low opinion of them, and that's acceptable to do so within our society at the moment. And like I say, that's something that's changed, I think, in regard to almost every other every other issue. And what's really concerning is that the depictions in the children's media that I've just talked about lay the groundwork for adult fears, for adult avoidance of people who have mental health conditions, and the disrespect really that's central to continued stigma and continued discrimination toward people with mental illness. And that's really what I want to finish it with, except to give you a whole load of references, because I found all of this stuff really fascinating to read, and I just thought, yeah, you may as well have them as well. So I'll thank you.
Okay, thanks, Coretti. When we were deciding the title for the talk back when it was Attitudes to Disability, you realise when Coretti starts into the analysis of how wide a topic that is, and you know, she's chosen to focus quite a bit on the attitudes to mental health in terms of the focus of the discussion. But there is other information there that I'll But I'm sure many of you have some comments or observations. You want Coretti back in? Oh, we've got the roaming mic for anyone who wants to ask a question. And then Coretti, if you want to get back up here, okay, anyone want to open the questions or comments?
I was waiting for the sorry, Pascal McKeown from NCAP. So, sorry, thank you. Pascal McKeown from NCAP. I was not wanting to jump in too much in terms of the learning disability discussion, but since I'm at the front and I have my hand up first, I mean, I suppose it does reinforce the fact that there are two populations that are still furthest away from either people's direct experiences or in the workplace, or just the opportunities that where you're likely to meet the rest of the populations, because I think some of it is about visibility, contact, relationships being able to be built up, if you like, is the heart of some of the problems, and I think that demonstrates quite clearly. In fact, there are two populations. I have an interest obviously in learning disability, who are furthest away from the experiences or how they're seen by other people. I think just one comment in terms of the slang language. I mean, one of the impacts, and this is my own analysis, if you like, of it, is a bit of American television, is around language that we no longer would think acceptable, such as retard, in terms of learning disability. And MENCAP did have a successful campaign against Ofcom because it was used in a Big Brother, if you like. I think it wasn't Big Brother itself, but it was an addendum programme to that. And what struck me about that was that the general population, as in the people from I mean, it had to go through, it was a parent who took the complaint first of all. Ofcom turned down the complaint because they could not see anything wrong in the terminology. And I think that's the other thing around stigma. The general population actually can't see what is the fuss, because it's in general parlance, or, I mean, in terms of retard, it is such an old word that people actually don't even remember it ever being used. I mean, it was out of vogue even when I was a child. It's an American, if you like, term around learning disability. So it struck me there's a population who needs help with understanding, in fact, why that word is offensive. So the general population didn't see retard as a terrible word and couldn't see what the problem was, but it was the depth of impact on the population of people with a learning disability. So I think it's the depth we have to actually look at in terms of that's why there's a concern around big population studies, because those depth of impacts don't come through quite clearly. So if you had that study, for example, in terms of just talking to people with a learning disability or people who have mental health problems, your figures obviously would be very different. And I think we do have to look at, well, what, targeted research in terms of the populations that you talked about there. So I think unfortunately slang is still with us. Unfortunately I have heard people call spazzes, so it's still around. I have to correct my own children because they don't even know what the word means, but they know it's an insult and they know people will get upset by it. So that's it.
Another comment over here.
Hi, my name is Rosemary Murray and I work with young people who have various disabilities. And just an observation that I have from this research is that people are sort of being categorised within disabilities. And I suppose the work that I have done or that I'm involved with highlights that actually there isn't these neat labels, if you like, and that the mental health and learning disability actually goes through all the disabilities very often. And it's almost like that positive discrimination, if you like, that the young people with a physical disability are seen as this visual disability. But actually those young people could have learning disability and mental health, and that was really brought home to me whenever the new disability strategy came out, and the first pre-consultation that the young people had with the department. It was actually a group of young people with learning disabilities, physical disabilities and sensory impairments, and the first thing they said was, you have said that this strategy is for young people with physical disabilities and sensory impairments, but in this room we have a mixture of young people, and there's a great and it has been highlighted by the young people, the misconception, if you like, that young people with physical disabilities are not and they're not necessarily going to have mental health problems or learning difficulties, but in fact there are a number of young people out there who do, and the young people that I've worked with are setting about actually creating that awareness. And one of the things that come out of that work that they are doing is that actually, if you look at CAMS, for example, and when we went to CAMS, we looked at how many young people with with any disability, in fact, is referred to CAMS, and in our research, actually, there were none. And that actually initiated a piece of work where we had a person from CAMS assigned to work with the young people to address their emotional well-being needs. But the difficulty is that if you have a young person with a physical disability who has additional difficulties, they are suppressing their emotions, their feelings, and as are a number of young people that we have discovered, actually young people with learning disabilities as well. They're suppressing their emotions. They don't want to say how they feel to parents, to people who they feel are giving them a good service, because they don't want to see themselves as an additional burden. And they feel that if they speak out, that's the way it will come across. So I just wanted to I'll get off my soapbox now. Just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. You want to come back at this point?
If I don't do this, Mike won't be able to hear it. Yeah. First of all, I'm sorry to hear that that kind of slang is still used in the playground. But I think that what Rosemary is saying is absolutely right, and I've certainly railed against that kind of categorisation myself of people, particularly young people. I have a disabled daughter, and she's visually impaired and has learning disability and other disabilities as well, so I understand entirely what you're saying. But on the other hand, I also worked some years ago with a group of young people who are all disabled to do a piece of emancipatory research, where they chose the research they wanted to do, and then I worked with them so they could do the research, and I just was there as a facilitator. all the young people had, all bar one of them, had cerebral palsy. And one of those young people with cerebral palsy also had the label of having a severe learning disability, but the rest of them, their labels were only physical disability. And boy, did those young people really not want to have anything to do with that young woman who had the label of learning disability as well. To the extent that actually it became a difficulty within the group, and I had no choice but, along with the youth workers who worked with me, to address it, and because they were excluding her. And when we really came down to it and, you know, got a chance to let them all talk openly and express what they were saying is, look, because we've got cerebral palsy, everybody assumes that we've also got a severe learning disability. Actually, that's not what they said. What they said was, because we've got cerebral palsy, everybody thinks we're thick. That's what they thought. That's what they said. And we don't, you know, and we have spent our lives saying, now hang on a second, I'm as bright as you. So don't you be, you know, making assumptions about me. So they didn't want then to have all that hard work that they'd done in asserting their intellectual ability undone by association. Now we then talked about, we worked through it, and we talked about the way they were discriminating against her and the way that other people had discriminated against them. And then it turned out that actually she was brilliant on the computer, because she's only very mild cerebral palsy, so she was actually able to do a lot of the computer work that the rest of them weren't. And it actually really helped, because they then started to question, what did this learning disability mean anyway? And, you know, why did they assume that somebody who had a learning disability was thick? Do you know, because actually somebody with a learning disability could be very bright, and they began to realise this young woman was as bright as any of them, in spite of the label. So it was, but I perfectly understood where, you know, by the end of it I thought, I get where you're coming from, because I'm sure I would feel the same, you know. So that's the first thing. And then the other thing is what you're saying about the no referrals of disabled young people, you know, to CAMS, to the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services. I absolutely, totally believe that, because it seems to me that there is a huge discrimination against, well, people with disabilities generally, but young people with disabilities especially, when it comes to loads of mainstream services, and they're excluded from loads of mainstream services. And what you're saying as well about young people suppressing their emotions, you know, because they don't want to add to the burden they see themselves as having. I mean, you can actually see that, and then you can see that down the road when they're 30 or 40 is when they start to have really severe mental health problems, because their emotional distress maybe, and you can perfectly understand as well the frustration, because the social isolation that young people with any kind of a disability faces, and especially if they have any kind of severe disability, their social isolation is so great that I think it's amazing that more of them haven't got very deep mental health issues, you know. So I completely agree, you know, with everything you're saying. And I think that maybe part of the problem is, and it goes back to the whole stigma thing about mental ill health, is that we don't see our mental health as something that we need to look after in the same way as we do our physical health. And as a result, people who aren't, you know, people who are particularly vulnerable because of the additional stresses in their lives, because of disability or whatever, aren't always, you know, like as a parent, I'll make sure that my daughter's teeth are okay.
Yeah.
But do I think enough about her emotional health? Probably not. Do you know?
I think it's part of the culture of disability, and I suppose I'm speaking from the experience of working with young people, and you know, they would all, particularly young people with physical disabilities, would say, you know, we have great lifestyle, everybody stepped back, let us go forward, you know, and they had all that patronising type of culture of helplessness almost imposed on them. And then whenever they come into adolescence and they want to do the things, so it's not cool to be the centre of attention and all of that, and they want to do the things that other young people want to do, they're not in that stream, if you know what I mean. It's just not there for them. And how do they then change their attitudes as well? And it's a minefield, and there's so much to it. And actually, the piece of work that the young people have initiated is now a research topic with Queen's, and
that will be rolling out across Northern Ireland. That'll be some of the research will roll out.
That's great. That sounds, well, very much needed.
Is it Nick?
Yeah, I'm Nick Acheson. I'm from the University of Ulster, well, I'm a colleague of Goretti's. And just one thing which I was want to ask you, which you haven't covered today, about whether you actually looked at the differences in the attitudes of those people who said they were disabled or long-term sick and those that hadn't. In the 2003 survey, there were differences, but they weren't that big. In other words, that people who identified themselves as disabled, on the definition we used, were as likely to be as prejudiced as non-disabled people. There wasn't that much difference between the two groups. And I'm wondering whether you'd like to comment on the evidence from this current survey, because it does reflect, I think, on some of the issues we've been discussing already, that disabled people are also people. And they suffer, that they experience the same set of assumptions, the same kind of prejudices, and the same kinds of views of the world they live in as most other people do. In many respects.
Yeah. No, I didn't actually look at it, although I will do before the ARK update is published. So we will have that information. But actually, you're right, and it's the same in the British. In the 2003 survey, that was the case, that disabled people were almost as discriminatory as others. And in the British social attitude surveys, that also came through. Interestingly enough, there's some. I mean, as you say, it's because disabled people live in the same world and suffer from the same influences of, media portrayals and stuff like that. But I don't know what, I'm not sure yet what the figures are for the 2009.
There's one corollary to that, actually, just to the last point, is that 2003 surveys, both in Northern Ireland and in Britain, suggested that a great many people who actually were disabled, according to the definition we used in the survey, and would be covered by the Disability Discrimination Act, didn't describe themselves as disabled, because people generally see disabled as a different group of people, apart from, separate from, and actually quite a small group. So there is actually a clear mismatch between how disability is viewed, as it were, in legislation and indeed in policy, and how individual people see themselves, or willing to accept a label, I think.
Absolutely.
I hope you don't mind me asking just one question. I was interested in the attitudes towards people, about people with mental health or learning disability or anything else, and their right or their willingness to see them marry into their family and to have a family. And in the light of the newspaper coverage and media coverage over the last couple of days of the couple with learning disabilities who lost a couple of their children into care and so on, I just wondered if you had anything further to add about that, because I think that I hadn't really engaged with that question before, and I think it's quite staggering that that's, we're less likely to be supportive of that, even though many of us may support equal rights and so on, and yet we don't seem to be supportive of that, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that, again, there may be some issues with the way that the questions were asked, because I think that, for example, there was an analysis and evaluation done of the British Social Attitudes Survey and some of those questions, and one of the things that they discovered was that people would feel differently about somebody with Down syndrome because of the chromosomal disorder that's involved in Down syndrome than they might with somebody with autism, for example, having a family. So those sort of genetic issues in there, which of course, are we saying that somebody, I hope that nobody would be saying that somebody with Down syndrome doesn't have a right to reproduce, but that seems to be part of what's behind people thinking. And also with mental ill health, there's it's a misconception, but there's an idea that there's an awful lot, that there's a huge genetic component to a lot of mental health conditions. And certainly we've all got different predispositions to this, that or the other, but there's that kind of view as well, like that it's something that goes, and it's a particular thing I think in Ireland, that mental health conditions get passed down through the generations. You hear, but her grandmother died in the psychiatric hospital. You do hear people saying stuff like that still, and there's this assumption that means that it's going to continue. So I think that part of it has got to do with that, rather than, and that's seen as being completely different in terms of people who've got any kind of a physical or a sensory impairment, although of course some sensory impairments are also genetic conditions, but it's not necessarily seen, I think, with the same difficulties. But there is a real issue about the right of, particularly of people with learning disability, to a family life, and maybe some of those people who've had their children removed by social services might be thinking about going to Europe or something to establish their right to a family life under the Human Rights Act. I don't know if that's something that is being thought of, but it's certainly yeah.
Okay, is there any final question? We're coming up to sort of lunchtime. Is there anyone who wants to ask or make any other observations? No? Okay, well just before I formally thank Loretti, can I just draw your attention to